She made the only offer she had left, a promise of sons to the mountain man the town called a killer. But what he did next? Nobody, least of all her, saw that coming. Every story teaches us something, and this one's a lesson in what happens when a good man gets pushed too far. Before we get into it, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get to it. The wind out on that plane had teeth. It bit through Nolan's thin shawl, right down to the bone. She sat with her back rammed against the splintered wheel of a broken-down supply wagon, wrists rubbed raw and bloody from the ropes. She didn't look at the men. She'd learned a long time ago that was a mistake. You don't look at predators. You don't show fear. You become a stone. You become part of the landscape and pray they pass you by. There were 3 of them. Army deserters, by the look of their filthy, mismatched uniforms. They were passing a bottle of cheap whiskey back and forth, and their laughter was getting louder, meaner. It echoed off the jagged peaks that surrounded the meadow, sounding like coyotes closing in. "Gonna get a pretty price for her down in Sonora," one of them slurred. He was a skinny weasel of a man with shifty eyes. He pointed a grimy finger at Nolan. "Maybe 100 pesos. Another one, a big brute with a gut straining the buttons of his blue coat, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her feet. 100 pesos ain't gonna keep a man warm through the winter. I say we keep her for ourselves. A man's got needs." The third one, the corporal with the faded stripes on his sleeve, just watched them, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He was the leader. He was the one she had to worry about. Nolan's heart was a drum against her ribs, a frantic beat counting down her last moments of hope. The grief for her husband was still a fresh, open wound. They'd killed him just 3 days ago. For what? For a piece of paper they said gave them rights to their land, their water. Now she was facing something far worse than just being a widow. She was property, and then a shadow detached itself from the line of pine trees at the edge of the meadow. He was huge, not just tall but wide, built like the mountains he lived in. He wore a heavy bearskin coat that made him look even bigger, more animal than man. He moved with a silence that was terrifying for someone of his size, his worn leather boots making no sound on the frost-hardened ground. Gideon Hart, the townspeople called him the Bear Man. They told stories about him, said he'd killed a man in a drunken brawl, said he'd run from the law and taken to the mountains to live like a savage. They said he was more beast than human. The deserters didn't see him until he was halfway across the meadow, walking toward them with a slow, deliberate pace. When they finally spotted him, their drunken laughter died in their throats. The skinny one fumbled for his rifle, but his movements were sloppy, clumsy with whiskey. The big one just stared, his mouth hanging open. Gideon didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't shout. He didn't do anything they expected. He walked right past them, ignoring their sudden tension as if they were nothing more than sagebrush. He stopped right in front of Nolan, and then he did the strangest thing of all. He lowered his massive frame to the ground, settling beside her, crossing his legs like he was joining her for a quiet afternoon chat. He just sat there, a silent mountain of a man, and his presence seemed to suck all the air out of the meadow. The soldiers looked at each other, their booze-addled brains struggling to make sense of what was happening. The corporal finally found his voice. "You best move on, mountain man," he called out, trying to sound tough. "This here is army business. Ain't got nothing to do with you." Gideon didn't even look at him. He just sat there, as still and solid as the granite peaks behind them. His silence was louder than any threat they could have made. That's when Nolan turned to him, her voice a raw, desperate whisper that cracked through the stone facade she'd built around herself. "Don't hurt me," she pleaded, offering the only thing she had left to bargain with. "I'll give you sons." The soldiers erupted in a burst of nervous laughter. This was more like it. This they understood. A woman begging, a fool too scared to fight. "Look at him!" the skinny one shouted, emboldened. "Too yellow to even speak." But then Gideon spoke, and his voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it was deep and steady, like a river flowing over ancient stones. It cut through their laughter and silenced it instantly. He looked directly at the corporal, his eyes clear and cold. A man who runs from his post, he said, each word landing like a hammer blow, ain't fit to call another man scared. The laughter was gone. The corporal's face turned a blotchy red. You watch your mouth, bear man. Gideon's gaze didn't waver. Courts-martial ain't kind to deserters, he continued, his voice carrying in the cold, still air. Especially not ones who attack innocent women. Reckon the army's still offering a reward for turning in runners. The soldiers shifted on their feet, their bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. They glanced at each other, then at their leader, who had gone pale under his grime. He's bluffing, the corporal stammered, but the lie was plain in his own ears. That's when Gideon slowly reached inside his bearskin coat. The deserters flinched, their hands going to their guns. But he wasn't pulling out a weapon. He pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. Even in the fading light, Nolan could see the official army seal at the top. Wanted notices, Gideon said simply, his voice flat. Got a whole stack of them. Seems you boys are worth $50 apiece, dead or alive. That was all it took. The bluff, if it was a bluff, was too risky to call. The soldiers scrambled, tripping over their own feet as they gathered their rifles and bedrolls. They didn't look back. They just melted back into the trees, leaving behind nothing but a half-empty whiskey bottle and the stench of their fear. In the sudden, ringing silence, Gideon turned his attention to Nalan. His hands, which looked like they could crush stone, were surprisingly gentle as he worked the knots of the rope binding her wrists. The rope fell away, and she rubbed the raw red grooves it had left behind. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. She moved a little closer to him, gathering her courage. "I meant what I said. I will be your wife. I will give you what you want." Gideon just shook his head, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It wasn't pity, it was something else. Something she hadn't seen in a man's eyes in a very long time. "No woman's kindness is bought with fear," he said, his voice softer now. "You don't owe me nothing." He stood up, his massive frame blocking out the last of the dying sun, and helped her to her feet. His mule, a patient, sturdy animal, stood nearby. With careful hands, he lifted her onto its back. The first snowflakes of the season began to drift down from the bruised purple sky, tiny white specks that caught in her long, dark hair like stars. She sat tall on the mule, no longer a captive, her world tilted on its axis. She looked down at the mountain man who had faced down 3 armed soldiers, with nothing more than quiet words and an unshakable core of truth. He hadn't hurt her. He hadn't taken what she offered. He had simply listened. And in doing so, he had given her back something she thought was gone forever. But Nalin was no fool. She knew that out here in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, where the only law was survival, a man's kindness could be the most dangerous thing of all, because it made you hope. And hope was a fragile thing, easily broken. The night fell fast and hard, drawing a curtain of black velvet across the mountains. The temperature plummeted, and the snow turned from soft flakes to tiny, sharp crystals that crunched under the mule's hooves. Gideon led the way on foot, a silent giant dusted in white, while Nalan rode, clutching her thin shawl, every muscle tense. Before they'd left the meadow, she'd watched him. He hadn't just untied her and left. He'd walked over to that broken-down army wagon. He moved through the scattered supplies and splintered crates with a purpose. His eyes weren't just looking, they were searching. And then he'd stopped. He reached into a shattered chest and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. A ledger. It wasn't big, but it felt heavy. She could see it in the way he held it. He'd slipped it inside his bearskin coat without a word, but she saw the slight bulge it made, felt the weight of it pressing against his chest like a secret. Now, as they climbed higher into the mountains, Nalin watched his back, her mind racing. Who was this man? He wasn't the savage the stories claimed. He was quiet, yes, but there was an intelligence in his eyes, a calmness in his actions that spoke of something other than brute force. But he was also a man who knew to look for a ledger in a wrecked army wagon. That wasn't random. That was the act of a man who knew what he was looking for. She sat straight-backed on the mule, her fingers twisting the frayed edge of her shawl. She was ready to slide off the mule's back and bolt into the darkness at the first sign of danger. She'd learned to expect cruelty from white men. It was their nature, as predictable as the sun rising in the east. But this one was a puzzle. After what felt like hours of climbing, a shape emerged from the swirling snow and darkness. A small cabin, a line shack, tucked against a sheer rock face. It wasn't much. Rough-hewn timber walls, a leaning stone chimney, a door that hung crooked on its hinges. But it was shelter, and right now shelter was everything. Inside, the cabin was one small room, but it was surprisingly clean and orderly. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a black cooking pot hanging from a hook. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and their scent, sage and something sweet like mint, mingled with the smell of pine and wood smoke. A narrow cot with a neatly folded blanket sat in one corner. Near the hearth was a thick pile of clean furs. "You take the cot," Gideon said, his voice low in the small space. "I'll sleep by the fire." He moved around the cabin with a practiced, easy grace, adding logs to the glowing coals in the hearth and setting a pot of what looked like stew to heat. He took down 2 tin cups from a rough-hewn shelf and a cloth-wrapped bundle of jerky. He did it all without looking at her, giving her space, letting her breathe. Nalin slid off the stool he'd pulled out for her and found her own place on a different one, farther away. She pulled a small pouch from her waist, taking out a bone needle and a spool of thread. Her fingers, deft and quick, began to mend a long tear in her skirt. She focused on the simple, repetitive motion. In, out, pull tight. A small act of control in a world that had spun wildly out of it. The only sounds were the crackle and hiss of the fire, the soft bubbling of the stew, and the whisper of her thread passing through the worn fabric. The silence between them wasn't easy. It was stretched thin, humming with unanswered questions and unspoken fears. But it wasn't threatening either. It was a silence of respect. He didn't push her to talk. She didn't feel the need to fill the space with nervous chatter. They were 2 wounded animals, sharing a den, learning the scent of each other. They ate the stew in that same silence. He gave her the larger portion, a simple, unspoken gesture. He ate with his back partially to her, as if to prove he was no threat. When they were done, he added more wood to the fire, the flames leaping up, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. He settled onto his pile of furs, and Nalin curled up on the narrow cot, her back pressed hard against the cold log wall, her eyes wide open in the dark. Sleep, when it finally came, was a dark, churning sea of nightmares. She saw the funeral pyre again, the smoke carrying the spirit of her husband up to the sky. She saw the faces of the soldiers, twisted with whiskey and hate. She saw the paper they held, the paper that they said made their crimes legal. She woke with a choked gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Tears streamed down her face, hot in the cold air. Across the small cabin, a figure sat by the dying fire. Gideon. He was awake, his massive silhouette a solid, reassuring presence in the flickering orange light. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there, a silent guardian, bearing witness to her grief. He gave her the gift of not being alone in her sorrow. The story spilled out of her then, a torrent of whispered words in the darkness. "They came at dawn," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "Said they had papers, said it was the law, but their breath stank of liquor. My husband, he tried to reason with them. He was a good man. He believed in the law, in words." She choked on a sob, the memory of physical pain in her chest. Gideon nodded slowly in the firelight. His eyes held a deep, weary understanding that went beyond simple sympathy. "Lots of bad things get done with a piece of paper and a badge to hide behind," he said, his voice a low rumble. As the first faint gray light of dawn began to seep through the single small window, turning the dark cabin into a world of gray and silver, Gideon moved. He reached into his bearskin coat. The leather ledger made a soft thud as he placed it on the rough table between them. "Found this in the wagon," he said, his voice even. "Might be you recognize some of the names." Her hands trembled as she reached for it. She opened the book. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, columns of names, columns of numbers, dates. Her breath caught in her throat. Her finger traced down a list, then stopped. A cold dread, sharp and terrible, washed over her. "These men," she said, her voice suddenly hard, stripped of all its earlier fear and grief, replaced now with something cold and dangerous. "They came to the reservation. They met with the army officers. They talked about water rights. They smiled and made promises." Her finger moved across the page to a column of numbers. "Railroad men. They paid so much money." Her eyes lifted from the page and met his across the table. "And then our streams began to dry up. The cattle grew thin and died. The children, the children were always thirsty." Gideon watched her face, his own expression grim in the growing light. "Seems those deserters weren't just running from their posts," he said quietly. "They were running with the payroll, and maybe running from being witnesses." Nolan closed the ledger. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. It was rage, a cold, pure rage that burned away the tears. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. It wasn't random. Those soldiers hadn't just stumbled upon her and her husband. They had targeted them. They knew who she was. They knew her husband was a leader who spoke out, and they knew she had seen them. The railroad men, the corrupt officers. They knew she could identify them. They weren't just getting rid of a witness in her husband. They were taking one hostage, or worse. She looked up at Gideon, a new kind of fear in her eyes, a fear not for herself, but for him, a fear of what she had dragged him into. "They will come looking," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It won't be just 3 drunken deserters now. It will be men with power, men with money, men with pieces of paper that say they can do no wrong." The ledger sat on the table between them, a leather-bound stick of dynamite with the fuse already lit. Yesterday, her life had been worthless to her captors. Today, with the knowledge she held, it was a liability they couldn't afford. And the man who had saved her was now standing right in the middle of the blast radius. The world outside the cabin door was a sea of white. The storm had settled in, blanketing the mountains in a thick, silent layer of snow. It was already knee-deep and falling so heavily you couldn't see the tree line just 100 yards away. Gideon stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, a dark silhouette against the swirling gray. "Storm's here for a while," he said, turning back into the cabin's warmth. His gaze met Nolan's where she sat at the table, the ledger still open before her. "Best we prepare." Nolan pushed herself to her feet, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as if it were armor. "I will help," she said. It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a statement of fact. A corner of Gideon's mouth twitched, the closest thing she'd seen to a smile. "Reckon you will," he said. He was right. She wasn't the type to sit by a fire while a man did all the work. That wasn't how she was raised. They spent the morning fortifying the small cabin against the relentless assault of the winter storm. Gideon showed her how to mix mud and moss to chink the gaps between the logs, plugging the little holes where the wind whistled through like a mournful ghost. Her small, nimble fingers were better at the task than his large ones, and they worked in a surprisingly efficient rhythm. When he went out to split more firewood from the lean-to, she followed him, ignoring his quiet grunt of protest about the cold. The wind was brutal, whipping her hair across her face and stealing her breath. But she matched him, trip for trip, her arms piled high with logs. His surprise was obvious, but she just met his look with a steady gaze. "My people know winter," she said, her voice sharp above the howl of the wind as she stacked the wood neatly inside the door. "We do not wait for men to keep us warm." Later, over a meager breakfast of dry corn cakes and venison jerky, Gideon spread the ledger out on the table again. The gray morning light filtering through the window made the neat columns of numbers and names look even more sinister. "This ain't just about water," he said, his thick finger tracing a line across the page. "Look here. These are land deeds, signed over by the same army officials, land that was supposed to be protected by treaty." He looked up at Nalan, his eyes dark with a grim understanding. "This is theft on a scale I can't even fathom. Men have been hung for less than what's written in this book." Nalan nodded, a bitter taste in her mouth. "The officers, they smile so much. They use words like progress and shared resources. They talk about the future, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. But it is our future they are stealing, our children's future. After breakfast, the snow let up just enough for them to venture out to check Gideon's trap lines. The wind was still a razor, but the visibility had improved. He showed her how he set his rabbit snares, simple loops of wire hidden on game trails. She watched patiently, then shook her head. "No," she said, her voice firm. "Like this." She took the wire from his calloused hands. Her fingers moved with a swift, certain grace, weaving a complex knot he'd never seen before, a small trigger made from a twig. "The rabbit, he is clever. He will test the wire. He will try to back out. But this," she explained, pointing to the trigger, "this way, he cannot twist free. It is quick. There is no suffering." Gideon watched her, his expression one of deep concentration. He wasn't offended. He was learning. "Your father teach you that?" he asked. A rare small smile touched Nalan's lips. It transformed her face, softening the hard lines of grief and fear. "Yes, he was a very wise man. He taught me that even the smallest creature deserves respect, that a hunter's skill is shown not in the kill, but in the lack of cruelty." She sat back on her heels, the finished snare a perfect deadly piece of engineering in her hands. "He said," she continued, her voice softer now, "that a man who has to prove his power through cruelty is a man who has no real power at all. He is already weak." Gideon nodded slowly, the words sinking in. "Sounds like a man worth knowing." The rest of the afternoon passed in the quiet, fire-lit warmth of the cabin. The storm raged outside, but inside a fragile peace began to settle. Nalan discovered a trunk in the corner filled with scraps of old fabric, faded calico, worn wool, soft buckskin. She laid them out on the floor, and with her bone needle and thread, began to piece them together into a quilt. Her needle flashed in the firelight, creating patterns of stars and mountains, stories he couldn't read but could feel the meaning of. Gideon sat in his usual spot by the fire, a piece of pale pine wood in his hands. His knife moved with a slow, deliberate care, the blade peeling away thin curls of wood. Gradually, the shape of a small, wild horse began to emerge from the block. The cabin was filled with the sounds of creation, the whisper of thread, the soft scrape of the knife, the steady crackle of the fire. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the tense, wary silence of strangers. It had become comfortable, like a shared blanket. They were two people who understood loss, who understood survival, and who were, perhaps, beginning to understand each other. As evening fell, Gideon cooked a simple supper of beans and salt pork. Nalan surprised him by adding a handful of dried berries she'd had in her pouch. Their tart sweetness cut through the richness of the pork, a small, unexpected gift. They ate without speaking, but the silence was companionable. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by violence. They were two people sharing a meal, surviving a storm. Later, as the fire burned low, casting long shadows, Nalan held up the half-finished quilt. The patterns were intricate, beautiful. Gideon placed the small, perfectly formed wooden horse on the mantel. They were small things, these creations, a quilt, a carving. But in the desolate cold of the mountains, they were acts of defiance. They were proof of hope. They were a quiet promise of a future that was more than just survival. Just as they were banking the fire for the night, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. A wolf's howl, long, low, and lonely. It was distant but clear, a stark reminder that the wilderness was always waiting, just outside their door. Nalan paused in spreading her blanket on the cot. Gideon moved to the door, checking the heavy wooden bar was secure. The howl faded away, leaving a silence that was deeper, more profound than before. In that silence, Nalan knew something fundamental had shifted. Trust, as fragile and rare as a winter rose, had begun to take root in the frozen ground of their shared ordeal. It was a terrifying feeling, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a mistake. The morning quiet was shattered by the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves, muffled but insistent against the fresh snow. Gideon grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door, his body instantly coiled and ready. But as a single rider on a sturdy bay mare crested the nearby ridge, his posture relaxed. "Esther," he breathed out. The woman who dismounted in front of the line shack was a force of nature. Her hair was a wild mane of iron gray escaping from under a practical wool bonnet. Snow clung to the hem of her heavy skirts, but she moved with the brisk, no-nonsense energy of a woman half her age. "Thank the Lord I found you, Gideon," she called out, her voice sharp and clear. "There's trouble brewing down in Miller's Creek. Big trouble." Gideon helped her up the icy, snow-covered steps into the cabin. Nalin hung back, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she kept at her waist, her eyes wary and watchful. This was a new piece on the board, and she didn't know if it was friend or foe. Inside, the woman, Esther, shrugged off her snow-dusted coat and went straight to the hearth, rubbing her chapped, red hands before the flames. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They've put up bounty posters all over town," she said, her sharp blue eyes darting from Gideon to Nalin and back again, "claiming this young lady here is a thief, a fugitive from Army justice. $25 for information leading to her capture. $50 for bringing her in." Nalin's spine went rigid as a post. Fugitive. Thief. The words were a physical blow. Gideon's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He poured a cup of coffee from the pot on the hearth and handed it to Esther. "There's more," she said, her voice grim as she accepted the steaming tin cup. "The names on the bottom of the poster, they're not lawmen, they're railroad men. And that's Snake, Captain Merrick, the one who's been overseeing the water rights negotiations." She took a sip of coffee, her eyes hard. "I taught at the agency school for 10 years, Gideon. I know a guilty conscience when I see one. Those men are running scared." "What are they scared of?" Gideon exchanged a look with Nellen. A silent question, a quick nod of agreement. He knelt, pried up a loose floorboard near the hearth, and pulled out the leather-bound ledger. He placed it on the table with a soft thud. Esther's eyes widened. She put down her cup and ran a worn finger down a column of names and numbers. "Merciful heavens," she whispered. "This is what they're after." Her gaze sharpened. "These are the water rights sales. But the numbers, they don't add up. Lord, they're double-dealing, aren't they? Selling the same rights twice over." "3 times in some cases," Nalin said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the first time she had spoken. "While our children go thirsty." A look of cold, familiar outrage settled on Esther's face. "I left that school because I couldn't stomach the injustice, the endless stream of lies and broken promises. But this," she closed the ledger with a decisive snap, "this is proof. This is a weapon." Her eyes burned with a fierce light. "This needs to go before Judge Matthews over in Stonebridge. He's one of the few honest men left on the circuit. He's not in anyone's pocket." "Stonebridge is a 4-day ride in good weather," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble as he glanced out the window at the still falling snow. "This ain't good weather. And every hour we wait is another hour those men have to find you," Esther countered, her tone sharp. "They'll be watching every main trail. Once the spring thaw comes, this whole mountain range will be crawling with their hired guns." Gideon turned to Nalin. The decision was not his to make. "It's your choice," he said. "We could try and wait it out here. This shack is well hidden." Nalin stood up, her small frame casting a long, determined shadow in the firelight. "Hiding has never saved my people," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them all. "Hiding is just a slower way to die. We must go. We must face them with the truth." Esther nodded, a look of profound respect on her face. "Spoken like a true warrior. I can get word to the judge, prepare him, but you'll have to be smart. You'll have to take the high trail through Thunder Pass. It's longer, more dangerous, especially in this weather. But it's the last place they'll expect anyone to be foolish enough to go." The rest of the day was a blur of hurried preparations. Gideon checked their meager supplies, packing dried meat, cornmeal, and coffee. He sharpened his axe until the edge gleamed. Esther, using a piece of charcoal on a scrap of leather, drew a detailed map of the high trail, marking hidden canyons and rock formations, noting where they might find shelter. Nalin sat by the fire, her fingers flying as she mended their only heavy wool blanket. Her stitches were small, tight, and perfect, a line of defense against the brutal cold that awaited them in the high pass. As evening fell, Esther prepared to leave. "I'll ride ahead to Stonebridge," she announced, pulling on her coat. "I'll start gathering affidavits. There are other families, white and native, who've had their water stolen. The more voices we add to yours, the louder the truth will be." "Much obliged, Esther," Gideon said, his voice rough with gratitude. "You're taking a big risk, getting involved in this." Esther gave a wry smile, her eyes twinkling. "Been taking risks my whole life, Gideon Hart. Might as well make them count for something." She turned to Nalin, her expression softening. "You keep that ledger safe, child, and you keep this big, stubborn bear of a man in line." A ghost of a smile touched Nalin's lips. "I will." After Esther rode off into the swirling snow, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. The only sounds were the scrape of Gideon's whetstone against the steel of his axe blade, and the soft whisper of Nalin's needle through the wool. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts of the journey ahead. "Reckon we should leave at first light," Gideon said finally, testing the razor-sharp edge of the axe with his thumb. Nalin tied off her final stitch and held up the mended blanket. "Before the snow gets any deeper," she agreed. She folded the blanket carefully, her face grim. "We will need its warmth. The spirits of Thunder Pass are not kind to travelers." Gideon just nodded. He knew the legends. He knew the pass was a treacherous, unforgiving place, even in the best of times. In the heart of winter, it was a death trap. But she was right. Hiding was no longer an option. Sometimes the most dangerous path was the only path that led to justice. And as he looked at the determined set of Nalin's jaw, he knew it was a path they would walk together. The dawn was a pale, wounded thing, painting the snow in shades of gray and pale rose. Gideon cinched the last rope on the sled he'd built. It was a crude affair, fashioned from old barn boards and runners he'd salvaged from a broken-down buckboard, but it was sturdy. The mule, draped in every blanket they owned, huffed clouds of steam into the frozen air and stomped its hooves impatiently. Nellen came out of the cabin, her breath pluming. She carried the ledger, now wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked deep inside a leather satchel. Her dark eyes met Gideon's over the back of the mule. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. They both knew the odds. They both knew what they were risking. Esther, who had returned before sunrise with a pack mule loaded with more supplies than Gideon could have imagined, adjusted her scarf and squinted at the sky. "Another storm's moving in from the north," she announced grimly. "We need to make good time while we can." The first few hours were brutal. The trail was buried under deep, fresh powder. The sled's runners snagged on hidden rocks and roots, and twice they had to stop and dig the entire thing out of a deep drift, their muscles screaming with effort. Nalin's hands, accustomed to needlework and preparing food, were quickly rubbed raw and blistered from gripping the sled's rough sides, helping to guide it. She never uttered a word of complaint, but Gideon saw her flexing her fingers, trying to work the pain out, when she thought he wasn't looking. By midday, the wind had become a physical force, a wall they had to push against. It drove tiny, sharp needles of ice into any exposed patch of skin. Their faces were numb, their eyes watering. Esther, who seemed to know every rock and tree in these mountains, pointed a mittened hand toward a dense stand of snow-laden pines. "There's an old trapper's cabin just beyond that ridge," she shouted over the wind. "Belonged to the Mackenzie brothers before they went bust. We can shelter there, wait out the worst of this." The cabin was little more than a ruin, 4 crumbling walls and a roof with more holes than timber, but it blocked the wind. It was a blessing. While Gideon saw to the mules, tethering them in a small lean-to, Esther and Nalin worked together, sweeping years of dust and debris from the small stone fireplace. Soon a sputtering, smoky fire was going, a small pocket of warmth in the vast, frozen wilderness. They huddled around it, sharing a meager meal of dried beef and biscuits, so hard they had to be dunked in melted snow to be eaten. As the fire grew stronger, chasing the worst of the cold from the small shelter, Esther's eyes grew distant, thoughtful. "You know," she said, her voice soft in the sudden quiet, "I remember your village, Nalin. I taught at the school there for 3 summers, before the new Indian agent came and changed everything. She pulled her shawl tighter. Such bright children, so eager to learn. Your little niece, Sarah White Deer, she had a mind for numbers like I've never seen. Nolan's head snapped up. Her composure, so carefully maintained, cracked. You, you knew my sister's daughter? Esther nodded, a sad smile on her face. Tears welled in her old eyes. I left when they brought in the new rules, forbidding the children from speaking their own language, forcing them to cut their hair. I couldn't be a part of it. I couldn't watch them chip away at those beautiful spirits, piece by piece. Her voice grew hard, the anger of a decade-old injustice still burning hot. I've been fighting them ever since, in my own quiet ways, helping families file paperwork, making sure their complaints are written down and sent to the right people. Most of the time it does no good, but sometimes a stone thrown in a pond can make a ripple that travels a long way. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the crumbling chimney. Outside, the wind howled and shrieked like a banshee. But inside that tiny ruined cabin, something fragile and warm was being built between the three of them. Gideon had been staring into the flames, silent, his large hands clasped between his knees. He spoke suddenly, his voice rough, torn from a place of deep pain. I lost my wife to the smallpox 5 years ago. He swallowed hard, his throat working. She was carrying our first child. He didn't look at them. He just kept staring at the fire. After that, I couldn't stay in town. The folks, they meant well, but their pity, it was like being buried alive. So I came up here, to the mountains. Figured I'd just disappear. Nalin listened, her own grief a heavy stone in her chest. When he fell silent, she began to hum. It was a low, ancient melody, a song that sounded like the wind through the pines, like water running over stones. The words, when she began to sing them, were in her own language, but the meaning was universal. It was a song of sorrow, of loss, but also of resilience. My mother sang the song, she explained softly when the melody faded, when the nights were long and the winter was hard. It is a song about the dawn. It says that no matter how dark the night, the sun always rises. It is a promise. Esther reached across the small space and took Nalan's hand. Her worn, calloused fingers were gentle against Nalan's fresh blisters. After a moment of silence, Esther began to sing too. It was an old hymn, her voice clear and surprisingly strong. The two melodies, one Apache, one Christian, one from the mountains, one from the plains, began to weave together. They didn't clash. They harmonized, creating something new, something beautiful and heartbreakingly sad. Gideon didn't sing. He just sat there, his massive shoulders slumped, his head bowed. But his presence was its own harmony, a deep bass note of shared pain. In that broken-down cabin, with a blizzard raging outside, three broken souls found a moment of grace. They were no longer just a mountain man, a school teacher, and a fugitive. They were a family, a strange, mismatched family, chosen not by blood, but by a shared understanding of loss, and a shared, stubborn refusal to be broken by it. The song ended. The melodies faded. But the warmth remained, a small, defiant fire in the heart of the storm. The snow was still falling, but somehow it seemed less threatening now. They would face it together. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world of blinding white, every surface coated in a thick, pristine blanket of snow. The morning was unnaturally bright, the sunlight glinting off a billion ice crystals, making the wilderness look like a fairy tale landscape. It was a beautiful, dangerous lie. They came to a fork in the trail, a place where a narrow, rocky path split off from the wider game trail they'd been following. And waiting for them, right at the center of the fork, was a lone rider. He sat on a magnificent black horse that was as out of place in this rugged country as a diamond on a dung heap. The man himself was tall and straight-backed, his clothes expensive, his bearing military. A polished silver badge gleamed on the chest of his tailored wool coat. But it wasn't the badge that sent a chill down Nolan's spine. It was his eyes. They were the color of a frozen lake, and just as cold. Captain Merrick, Esther whispered, her voice tight with dread. He's not real law. He's a railroad enforcer, a hired gun with a fancy title and a purchase badge. Merrick urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves making soft, plopping sounds in the deep snow. His smile was a thin, bloodless slash in his clean-shaven face. It never came close to reaching his eyes. "A fine morning for a journey," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, utterly alien in this wild place. "Though I must warn you, these trails have become quite dangerous of late. We're searching for fugitives, thieves who made off with valuable army property." Gideon moved, placing his own large body between Merrick and the sled, where Nalin and Esther sat. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice a low, non-committal rumble. Merrick's cold eyes swept over them, over their crude sled and tired mules. It was a look of utter contempt. "Mind if I have a look at your cargo?" he asked, though it was clearly not a question. "Purely routine, you understand. A matter of public safety." "No need to trouble yourself, Captain," Gideon replied, his voice calm. He reached slowly into his coat. Merrick's hand drifted down, resting casually on the butt of the pearl-handled pistol at his hip. But Gideon didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a crumpled, official-looking letter. "Just delivering some winter stores to the Methodist Church down in Stonebridge. For the orphanage. Reverend Wilson is expecting us." Merrick's eyes narrowed. He took the letter. It was real enough. Esther had the foresight to bring it from her last legitimate supply run. But the date on it was weeks old. They all held their breath as he studied it, his expression unreadable. "Reverend Wilson, you say?" Merrick's voice was laced with suspicion. "An interesting fellow, known to be rather sympathetic to certain causes." "Just good people doing the Lord's work, Captain," Esther piped up, her voice the prim, unshakable tone of a schoolteacher addressing a misbehaving student. "Surely you wouldn't want to be the man who delayed vital supplies for a church full of orphan children. Think of the paperwork." A muscle twitched in Merrick's jaw. He was clearly itching to tear their sled apart, but Esther's words had boxed him in. Making trouble for a church for orphans was bad for business. It drew the wrong kind of attention. He handed the letter back to Gideon with a flick of his wrist. "Of course not," he said, his smile tightening. "But I will offer a word of advice. These trails aren't safe. There are desperate men about. You might not get as far as you're hoping." The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the cold, clear air. "Much obliged for your concern, Captain," Gideon said, his face a mask of stone. They watched as Merrick wheeled his magnificent horse around, kicking up a spray of snow. He paused at the top of the rise, a dark silhouette against the brilliant white. "Good day to you, folks," he called back. "Do be careful." Then he was gone. No one spoke. The silence was deafening. They all knew what had just happened. He knew. He might not have been sure before, but he was now. The letter had been too convenient, their story too neat. He was playing with them. "He know," Nalin said softly, her voice flat. "Or he suspects enough that it makes no difference." She pointed a trembling finger toward the other path at the fork, a narrow, dark slash between two looming hills. "There is another way, Raven's Hollow. The ravine is tight, dangerous, but the soldiers, they always avoided it. My people say it is a place of bad spirits. Too many shadows. Too many places for an ambush." Gideon stared at the dark opening. "That'll add at least a day to our journey. Maybe two." "Better a slow journey than a short one," Esther said grimly. Without another word, they turned the sled and the mules toward the darker path. As they entered the mouth of the ravine, it was like stepping from day into twilight. The high rock walls on either side blocked out the sun, and the temperature dropped several degrees. The air grew still and heavy. The mules' ears twitched nervously. They were heading into the shadows, both literally and figuratively. That evening, they made camp in a shallow cave, a dark mouth in the rock wall. They kept the fire small, just enough to cook a meal and keep the deep cold at bay. While Esther and Nalin prepared food, Gideon sat a little ways apart, his knife and a piece of wood back in his hands. Nalin watched him. The firelight flickered across the planes of his face, making him look like something carved from the mountain itself. His big hands, which could snap a man's neck as easily as a twig, moved with an almost impossible delicacy. The shape he was carving was familiar to her. It was the beginnings of a cradleboard, the gentle, curved frame designed to keep a baby safe and close to its mother's heart. But as the basic shape emerged, his hand slowed. His knife stopped. He just sat there, staring at the unfinished piece of wood, his expression lost and distant. Nalin walked over to him quietly, holding out a tin cup of hot, steaming tea. She looked at the object in his hands. "Among my people," she said softly, her voice barely disturbing the deep silence of the ravine. "To make a cradleboard is to call to the spirit of a child. It is a prayer, a hope." She looked at the still knife, the frozen hands. "But you have left it unfinished." Gideon didn't look up. He just ran his thumb over the smooth wood. "Been a long time," he said, his voice rough, "since I let myself think about possibilities." He stared out into the profound darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. "Seems foolish to even think about starting over." Nalin's gaze was steady, her voice gentle but firm. "Hope is never foolish, Gideon. Hope is the fire you build in the dark. It is what carries us through places like this." Her fingers lightly brushed the unfinished cradleboard. "Like this ravine. Sometimes the harder path is the only one that leads to safety." The piece of wood sat between them, a silent testament to a future that was not yet written. A question and a promise, all at once. Around them, the ancient rocks of the hollow stood as silent witnesses. The night was full of danger, but for the first time, it was also full of a fragile, terrifying, and absolutely necessary hope. The walls of Raven's Hollow were a claustrophobic maze of shadow and ice-streaked rock. Progress was agonizingly slow. Gideon led the mule, carefully picking a path through the treacherous, uneven ground, his boots slipping on hidden patches of ice. The sled runners hissed softly against the snow, the only sound in the dead, still air. Then a sharp, ugly crack echoed off the canyon walls. "Whoa! Easy now!" Gideon called out, his voice a low soothe as he grabbed the mule's bridle, steadying the startled animal. The sled had lurched to a halt. The right runner had snapped clean in two, the splintered wood digging into the snow like a broken bone. Esther climbed stiffly down from the sled, her boots crunching. She surveyed the damage, then looked up at the sliver of gray sky visible between the towering rock walls. "We can't go any further today," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Not with dark coming on and this sled broken. We need to make camp, now." Nalin was already moving, her sharp eyes scanning the terrain. "There," she said, pointing to a shallow overhang a little way up the slope. "It's not much, but it will offer some protection from the wind." They began the back-breaking work of unloading the sled. Gideon handled the heaviest sacks of supplies, his muscles straining, while Nalin and Esther worked together, carefully transferring the more precious cargo. The ledger, their reason for being in this God's-forsaken place, remained safe, tucked deep inside Esther's pack. "I'll gather pine boughs," Nalin announced, adjusting her shawl, "for bedding, and to build a windbreak." "I'll help," Esther said immediately, pulling on her worn gloves. "4 hands are always faster than 2. As the 2 women disappeared into the gloom of the pine trees that clung to the canyon slopes, Gideon knelt beside the broken sled. He didn't curse. He didn't sigh in frustration. He simply set to work. His movements were calm, methodical. He examined the splintered wood, his calloused fingers testing the grain, his mind already working on a solution. From the edge of the trees, Nalin paused, her arms full of fragrant pine boughs, and watched him. She saw the patience in his hands, the quiet competence. He wasn't a man who was ruled by his anger or his fear. He was a man who met a problem and calmly, quietly set about fixing it. She thought of the other men who had shown interest in her after her husband's passing. They came with loud words and bold promises, offering protection but demanding obedience. They wanted to own her spirit. Gideon asked for nothing. He simply gave. His kindness, his protection, it wasn't a transaction. It was just who he was. When she and Esther returned, their arms laden, Gideon had nearly finished the repair. He'd found a sturdy branch, and using his axe and knife, had shaped it into a splint. He was now wrapping it tightly with strips of rawhide he'd soaked in melted snow. The rawhide would freeze solid overnight, creating a bond as strong as iron. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. They worked together as a team, building their small camp under the rock overhang. They laid the pine boughs down, creating a soft, fragrant mattress that insulated them from the frozen ground. They built a small lean-to against the rock face. Soon, a tiny, cheerful fire was crackling, its light pushing back the oppressive darkness of the ravine, and the smell of rabbit stew bubbled up from their cooking pot. Esther stirred the pot with a stick, her face thoughtful in the firelight. "Once we reach Stonebridge," she said, her voice low, "we need to move fast. Sheriff Tomlin is a good man, an honest man. He served with the Union Cavalry. He's helped Native families before, when they had a legitimate, documented claim." "Can he be trusted?" Nolan asked, the question sharp. She had learned the hard way that a white man's word was often as brittle as winter ice. "He follows the law," Esther replied. "The actual law, not the kind that railroad men buy and sell over whiskey and cigars. That ledger is a documented claim. It shows a crime has been committed. He'll have no choice but to act on it." They ate their stew in a comfortable silence, the fire their only companion. High above them, the stars began to appear in the narrow strip of sky, cold and distant diamonds on black velvet. Nalin found herself tracing the constellations, remembering nights around a different fire, listening to her husband tell the old stories of the star people. "My husband," she began, the words coming out before she could stop them, surprising even herself. "He was a good man, a kind man, but even he believed a woman's worth was measured by the sons she could bear." She ran her finger around the rim of her tin cup. "When I could not give him a child, he grew distant. He was never cruel, just disappointed, as if I had failed at my one true purpose." Gideon looked up from the fire, his face gentle in the flickering light. "Family ain't just about blood," he said, his voice soft, but carrying the unmistakable weight of his own loss, his own hard-won understanding. Esther reached over and squeezed Nolan's hand. "He's right about that," she said, her voice firm. "Sometimes the family you find is stronger than the family you're born into, because it's built on choice, on respect." Nolan felt something shift deep inside her, a painful, wonderful cracking, like a frozen river breaking up in the spring thaw. The way Gideon looked at her, the way Esther held her hand. They didn't see a barren widow. They didn't see a fugitive or a burden. They just saw her, their kindness, their acceptance. It wasn't a down payment on some future obligation. It was a gift, freely and unconditionally given. The fire popped, sending a spray of golden sparks spiraling up into the immense darkness. The hollow was silent, the wind having died down. There were still miles to go, dangers yet to face. But right there, in that small circle of warmth, surrounded by two strangers who had become more family than her own blood, Nalin found something she never expected to feel again. Peace, a fragile, tentative, but very real peace. Stonebridge appeared suddenly, a cluster of dark wooden buildings nestled in a snow-covered valley. It looked like a child's toy town, scattered at the foot of the massive, indifferent mountains. The clear, cold sound of a church bell echoed across the valley, calling the town to Sunday service. Esther pulled her shawl tight, her eyes gleaming with a new, strategic light. "We're going to church," she announced, her tone leaving no room for debate. Gideon, who had been scanning the town with the wary eyes of a wolf, tensed. "Church? Esther, we'll be sitting ducks in there. Trapped." "We'll be protected, Gideon," she countered, her voice sharp. "This is a God-fearing town. Even a snake like Merrick won't dare cause a commotion in the Lord's house during Sunday service. It's the safest place for us to be seen. We need to win the people before we can win the law. And it starts here." Nolan said nothing. She just sat on the sled, her back ramrod straight, her expression unreadable as she stared at the simple white church with its tall, hopeful steeple. They left the mules and the sled at the hitching post and climbed the wooden steps. The moment they pushed open the heavy doors, a wave of silence washed over the congregation. Every head turned, every eye fixed on them, on her. Whispers rustled through the pews like dry leaves. She was an Apache woman, in their church. The air grew thick with suspicion and hostility. The inside of the church smelled of old pine, beeswax, and damp wool. Sunlight, filtered through the frosted glass windows, cast a pale, holy light over the worn wooden pews. Esther, seemingly oblivious to the stairs, guided them to a pew at the very back, where Gideon could watch both the main door and the side entrance. The preacher, a lean, tired-looking man named Reverend Mason, paused for only a fraction of a second when he saw them. Then he continued his sermon, his voice steady. He spoke of welcoming the stranger, of finding grace in unexpected places. When the time came for the communal prayer, Naline bowed her head, her quiet dignity a silent rebuke to the hostile stares. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mood in the church began to shift. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, who had been clutching her hymn book like a weapon, lowered it to her lap and gave a tiny, hesitant nod. Farmer Jenkins, a man whose face was a roadmap of hardship, touched the brim of his hat when his eyes met Gideon's. By the end of the service, the open hostility had softened into a wary curiosity. After the last parishioner had left, Esther went straight to Reverend Mason. She spoke in low, urgent tones. The Reverend's kind face grew grave as he listened. He nodded, then disappeared into his small study at the back of the church. He returned a few moments later with another man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn cavalry coat over his Sunday best. A sheriff's badge was pinned to the coat. His hair was silver, and his face was deeply lined, but he carried himself with an unbending military discipline. "Miss Cale," he said, his voice a low baritone. His eyes, thoughtful and intelligent, moved over their small group. "Reverend Mason tells me you have a matter of some urgency." "It's best we discuss it in private, Sheriff Tomlin," Esther said. In the Reverend's study, a small book-lined room warmed by a pot-bellied stove, the story came tumbling out. Gideon stood by the window, a silent, massive guardian. Esther carefully unwrapped the ledger from its oilcloth and laid it on the Reverend's desk. Sheriff Tomlin sat down and began to read. He didn't rush. His weathered finger traced each line, each column of numbers. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a clock on the wall and the soft hiss of the stove. Finally, he looked up. He looked directly at Nullen. "Army quartermasters," he said, his voice flat, "selling water rights guaranteed to your people by federal treaty." "Yes," Nullen said simply. Her voice did not tremble. The sheriff's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. "This explains the telegraph I received yesterday morning, from the railroad, warning me that a dangerous Apache fugitive might be heading this way." He closed the ledger with a soft, final thud. "Seems to me the only thing dangerous about you, ma'am, is the truth you're carrying." Reverend Mason, who had been listening in silence, stepped forward. "They'll need a safe place to stay while you investigate this, Sheriff." He looked at Nayland, then Gideon. "My home is humble, but you would be welcome." That evening, they sat in the pastor's small, warm cabin. His wife, a tiny, bird-like woman with flour on her hands, fussed over them, insisting they eat a proper meal of beef stew and fresh-baked bread. It was the first real food they'd had in days. Gideon still stood by the window, his eyes scanning the quiet, snow-covered street. The ledger was hidden, tucked safely beneath a loose floorboard in the pastor's bedroom, but its presence was a palpable thing, a sleeping giant in the small house. Nolan sat at the kitchen table, helping Mrs. Mason sort dried beans. The simple domestic task was calming, grounding. She had survived the first test. She had walked into the lion's den and, for now, had walked out unscathed. Sheriff Tomlin had promised to start his investigation first thing in the morning, but he'd left them with a warning. "The railroad has deep pockets and long arms," he'd said, his hand on the doorknob. "Desperate men do desperate things. Don't let your guard down. Not for a second." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing the small town in a false peace. Inside the pastor's home, they had found a momentary sanctuary, but no one, not for a single second, believed it would last. Sheriff Tomlin sat hunched over the ledger in the warm glow of the pastor's hearth, the firelight glinting off the silver at his temples. Mrs. Mason's knitting needles provided a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the wind rattling the window panes. These names, Tomlin murmured, tapping a page with a blunt finger. It's a who's who of every corrupt official and greedy land baron, from here to the territorial capital. Water rights sold 3 separate times, to the railroad, to the cattle syndicates, and to the mining companies. He looked up from the book, his eyes finding Nolans across the room. All while your people's wells went dry. Gideon shifted his weight by the window, his bearskin coat rustling. The movement was a demand. So what do we do? The sheriff closed the ledger, his face set like granite. We do it in the open. A public hearing, right on Main Street, where every citizen of this town can see the evidence and hear the testimony for themselves. He held up a hand to cut off Gideon's immediate protest. I know it's dangerous, son, but justice done in the shadows is no justice at all. We need the good people of this town to see these men for what they are. When? Esther asked, her face pale with worry. 2 days, Tomlin said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Wednesday morning. The circuit judge is due on the mail coach. We'll need his authority to make it all stick. Nalin, who had been quietly stitching a small piece of leather at the kitchen table, finally spoke, her voice low but clear. These men will not come to your hearing peacefully. No, ma'am, Tomlin agreed, his eyes grim. I don't expect they will, but it'll force their hand. They'll have to show their true colors out in the daylight. Just then, a sharp, insistent knock echoed through the small house. Everyone froze. Gideon's hand went instinctively to the knife on his belt. But it was only Reverend Mason, his face ashen, returning from the telegraph office. He held out a flimsy yellow piece of paper to the sheriff. Tomlin read it aloud, his voice dropping an octave. Bounty hunters deputized by railroad authorities. Stop. 5 men riding north from Fort Gibson. Stop. Armed and considered extremely dangerous. Stop. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hiss and crackle of the fire. Gideon stared out the window into the deep, impenetrable blackness. We should go, he said, his voice a low rumble. Get Nolan out of here. Find another way. No. The word was soft, but it cut through the fear in the room like a razor. Nolan stood up from the table and walked across the room to where Gideon stood, a silent, brooding mountain of a man. In her hands she held the small leather pouch she'd been stitching. Among my people, she said, her voice steady, when we choose our family, we give a part of ourselves, to bind our spirits. She opened the pouch. Inside lay a single, thick braid of her own dark, glossy hair. It is not a bond of blood. It is a bond of choice, and it is stronger than anything. She held it out to him. Gideon's massive hands that could split logs and tame wild horses, trembled slightly as he took the small, soft pouch. His throat worked, but for once no words would come. He looked from the braid to her face, and in his eyes she saw not just gratitude, but a fierce, profound devotion. He carefully tucked the pouch inside his coat, over his heart. Esther turned away, wiping her eyes. Mrs. Mason suddenly found her knitting intensely interesting. Sheriff Tomlin stared deep into the fire, giving them the privacy of the moment. Much later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, Gideon sat alone by the embers of the fire. He pulled the unfinished cradleboard from his pack, and he pulled out his knife. The blade began to move again, but with a new purpose, a new certainty. In the flickering, dying light, an eagle began to take shape in the wood, its wings spread wide, its eyes sharp, a symbol of vision, strength, and freedom. He worked for hours, each cut precise, each line perfect. He would pause every so often, and his hand would go to the small leather pouch resting against his chest, as if drawing strength from it. Just before dawn, he set the knife down. The cradleboard was finished. It was more than a carving, it was a promise, a testament, a declaration of war against the darkness. Outside, the snow was still falling, and the world was quiet. But inside the small pastor's cabin, something had been forged in the fire of adversity, a family, and they were ready for the battle to come. Main Street was a sea of grim, pale faces. The dawn had come, gray and grudging, and a bitter wind swept down from the high peaks, kicking up dust and rattling the wooden signs. The townsfolk were there, huddled together in small, anxious groups. their breath misting in the cold air. They'd come out of a sense of duty, of curiosity, and of fear. Nalin walked beside Gideon, her head held high. She could feel their eyes on her. Hundreds of them. Whispers followed her like the rustle of dry leaves. She was the outsider, the Apache, the fugitive. To them, she was the cause of this trouble that had descended on their quiet town. Gideon walked with her, a silent granite wall at her side, his new deputy's badge a small, defiant glint of silver on his bearskin coat. Sheriff Tomlin stood on a makeshift platform built from old freight pallets, the ledger held tightly in one hand. His face was grim. Esther sat at a small table nearby, a stack of her carefully prepared affidavits held down by river stones against the biting wind. Then came the sound of hooves, not the plodding gait of farm horses, but the sharp, disciplined tattoo of cavalry mounts. Captain Merrick rode at the head of 5 men, each of them hard-faced and armed to the teeth. Merrick swung down from his horse with an arrogant grace, his polished boots thudding on the frozen ground. "Quite a little circus you've arranged, Sheriff," Merrick called out, his voice a silken, condescending drawl that carried across the square. He let his cold eyes drift over Nalin with open contempt. "Though I fail to see why all these good honest folks should have to stand out in the cold to listen to the lies of one thieving squaw." A low, ugly murmur rippled through the crowd. Gideon's hands clenched into fists the size of cannonballs, but Nalin laid a hand on his arm, a silent command to wait. "This hearing will come to order." Sheriff Tomlin's voice boomed out, cutting through the tension. He held up the ledger. "We are here to examine evidence of criminal conspiracy and illegal water rights sales that have harmed every single person in this valley, on the reservation and off it." "That book," Merrick snapped, stepping onto the platform as if he owned it, "is a fabrication, a collection of forgeries stolen from Army archives and doctored by this woman and her radical sympathizers." He spat the word sympathizers like it was poison. That's when Esther Cale stood up. The small, gray-haired school teacher seemed to grow 10 feet taller. "I have here," she said, her voice clear and ringing, not a tremor in it, 37 sworn and notarized affidavits from your neighbors, farmers, ranchers, tribal members, each one detailing how their water was stolen. Her voice grew stronger, fueled by a lifetime of righteous anger. "I have geological surveys and maps proving the same water rights were sold 3 times over. And I have freight receipts, Captain Merrick, for payments made to you by the railroad, signed in your own hand." The crowd leaned in, a collective gasp going through them. Merrick's face flushed a dark, ugly red. But before he could speak, Nalin stepped forward. She began to speak in her own language, her voice a beautiful, clear melody that silenced the crowd. Then she switched to English, her voice low, but carrying an immense power. "My grandfather taught me that water has no owner," she said, her eyes sweeping over the faces before her. "Like the wind, like the sun, it is a gift from the Creator to all living things. But these men," she gestured to the ledger, "they believe their pieces of paper are more powerful than the Creator. They sell what cannot be owned, while your children go thirsty and your crops wither in the fields." A woman in the crowd clutched her shawl tighter. A farmer slowly took off his hat, twisting the brim in his work-roughened hands. "3 summers ago," Nalin continued, her voice gaining strength, "my village's creek ran dry. They told us it was a drought, a natural cycle." Her voice hardened. "But a mile upstream, the railroad's water tanks were always full. Their great steam engines never knew thirst, while our elders were forced to drink from muddy puddles." Merrick lunged forward, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "This is absurd, slander and lies." "I believe the evidence," Sheriff Tomlin cut in, his voice like a whip crack. He opened the ledger, pointing to the entries. "These numbers don't lie, Captain. The same water rights sold on May 12th to the railroad, then sold again on June 1st to the mining company, and sold a 3rd time on June 20th to the cattle syndicate, all signed off by the same corrupt Army quartermaster who received 3 separate payments from you." He looked out at the crowd. "While our own town wells started running low, these men were getting rich, selling our water back to us." The murmuring in the crowd grew louder, angrier. "That's why Miller's Creek dried up last spring," a rancher shouted from the back. and why the railroad always has water to spare, even in the driest years. Another voice added. The tide was turning. The anger of the crowd was shifting, like a great beast waking from a long sleep. The hostile glares that had been directed at Nolan were now turning on Merrick and his men. The farmers who had come to scoff were now nodding, their faces dark with understanding. Merrick's composure finally shattered. His face was a mask of pale fury. Nolan Yazi, he screamed, his voice cracking. You are under arrest for the theft of federal documents and seditious conspiracy against the United States government. The words hung in the frozen air, a threat of federal power that was meant to cow them all into submission. But before Merrick or his men could move, Gideon stepped forward. He moved between Merrick and Nolan, but he wasn't holding a rifle. He wasn't reaching for his knife. In his massive hands, he held the cradleboard. He held it out, not as a shield, but as a statement. The morning light caught the polished wood, the intricate eagle carving, the delicate beadwork Nolan had woven. It was a symbol of life, of family, of a future. It was everything Merrick and his greed were trying to destroy. No, Gideon said. His voice was quiet, but it rolled across the square with the force of an earthquake. She stays. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact, an unmovable truth. Merrick's eyes flickered from the cradleboard to Gideon's face, and he saw it. This wasn't about law or fugitives anymore. This was a man protecting his family. Sheriff Tomlin stepped down from the platform, planting himself firmly between Merrick's men and Nolan. Captain Merrick, he said, his voice dangerously calm, that is my deputy you're threatening, and this is my jurisdiction. Any attempt to unlawfully detain this woman will result in your immediate arrest. You have no authority, Merrick shrieked, but his words were drowned out by a new sound. The sound of movement. It started with one person. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, a woman who had glared at Nolan in church, stepped out of the crowd and stood beside her. Then old Thomas Wheeler, the farmer who'd lost half his herd to the manufactured drought, came and stood on her other side. Then 2 more, then 10, then 20. Within seconds, a human wall had formed. The citizens of Stonebridge, men and women, young and old, stood shoulder to shoulder, a silent, unyielding barrier protecting the Apache woman they had once scorned. We have authority, called out Widow Jenkins, her voice quavering but strong. This is our town, our water, and we will not stand for any more of your lies and your theft. Merrick's men shifted nervously in their saddles, their eyes wide. They were hired guns, not soldiers. They were paid to intimidate, not to fight an entire town of enraged citizens. This isn't over, Merrick snarled, but the threat was empty. His hand fell away from his gun. He looked at the wall of determined faces, at the sheriff, at the mountain of a man holding a cradleboard, and he knew he had lost. I believe it is, Captain, Sheriff Tomlin said, his voice cold as steel. I suggest you and your men ride out of my town, now, while you still can. A small child's voice piped up from the crowd, loud and clear in the sudden silence. Mama, look! The bad men are leaving! A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, breaking the last of the tension. It was the final humiliation. Merrick's face contorted in a spasm of pure, impotent rage. Without another word, he spun on his heel, vaulted onto his horse, and spurred the animal into a gallop, his men scrambling to follow. The thunder of their retreat faded, leaving only the sound of the wind. The townsfolk held their formation until the riders were nothing but a speck on the horizon. Then, slowly, the human wall dissolved. Nolan turned to Gideon. Her eyes fell to the cradleboard, to the soaring eagle, to the promise of a future. Their gazes met, and in that look, 1,000 words were spoken. They had won. Not with guns, but with truth. Not with violence, but with community. The sheriff's office was warm, smelling of wood smoke, old paper, and strong coffee. Sunlight streamed through the window, free of its earlier gloom. Sheriff Tomlin slid a tarnished, star-shaped deputy's badge across his cluttered desk. It's temporary, he said, scratching his signature on a piece of official paper. Just until the circuit judge makes a formal ruling on the water rights and issues federal warrants. But this gives you the legal authority to protect Miss Yazzie, should any of Merrick's cronies get any foolish ideas. Gideon picked up the badge. The weight of it was substantial in his palm. He pinned it to his bearskin coat. It felt strange, but right. Much obliged, Sheriff. Nolan sat in a chair by the stove, watching. The sheriff had treated her with a quiet, formal respect from the beginning. Now the whole town seemed to be following his lead. When they stepped out onto the boardwalk, the change was palpable. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was in the small things. Mr. Peterson, who was sweeping the front of his bakery, stopped and touched the brim of his hat. Mrs. Wheeler, who was on her porch shaking out a rug, offered a warm, genuine smile. On the steps of the milliner's shop, they found a basket. Inside, covered with a clean linen cloth, was a loaf of bread, still warm from the oven, a wedge of cheese, and a jar of apple butter. There was no note. None was needed. The town, Nolan said softly, her hand resting on the basket's handle, has chosen its side. They walked down the street, no longer fugitives, but neighbors. The suspicious glances had been replaced by nods of acknowledgement. Not everyone, of course. There were still some who hurried past, their eyes averted, but the shift was real. It was a beginning. That evening, they stood in the pastor's small frost-bitten garden. A few stubborn purple asters still bloomed, their color a defiant splash against the gray fence. Nolan knelt and gently touched a petal. "My mother grew flowers like these," she said, her voice quiet with memory. "She used to say that beauty always finds a way, even in the hardest ground." Gideon stood beside her, the silver badge gleaming softly in the fading light. He watched as she rose, her face softened by the twilight. "I have been thinking," she said, her gaze direct, unwavering, "about staying, but not because of the promise I made in fear, not to give you sons." She took a small breath. "A house is built by hands, but a home is built by hearts." The words hung in the still, cold air between them, full of weight and meaning. "You are free, Nolan," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You can go anywhere you choose. The ledger is safe. The truth is out." She took a step closer to him. "I choose to stay," she said, her voice firm. "Not from debt or duty, but because here, in this place, I have found something worth building." Gideon was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "Will you build it with me?" It was the simplest of questions, but it held an entire world. A world of partnership, of respect, of a future chosen, not forced. Nellen didn't answer with words at first. She simply reached out and took his hand. Her small, slender fingers intertwined with his large, calloused ones. A perfect fit. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain in the growing dusk. "Together." The sound of hammers echoed through the valley, a cheerful, busy rhythm that replaced the winter's fearful silence. The town was building them a home. A plot of land near the church, donated by the parish, buzzed with activity. Men who had stood against them just weeks ago now worked side by side, raising the timber frame. Esther Kale, a clipboard in her hand, was the undisputed general of the operation. "That beam needs to be level, Thomas Wheeler," she'd call out. "This house is going to stand straight and true, just like the people living in it." Nalin and Gideon worked at the center of it all, a quiet, efficient team. She would measure and mark. He would saw the boards. He would lift the heavy beams into place. She would be there to secure them. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, a fluid grace that made the other townsfolk smile. The women from the church sewing circle brought quilts, their bright patterns a welcome splash of color. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, arrived with a set of new tin plates and cups. The school children, released from their lessons, came in a shy, giggling group, bearing small handmade gifts. A lopsidedly whittled horse from one of the boys, a corn-husk doll with yarn hair from a little girl. Each gift was accepted with a grace and gratitude that cemented the bonds being formed. When the last roof beam was finally hoisted into place, Gideon slipped away. He returned from the pastor's barn carrying the cradleboard, but it was transformed. During the quiet evenings, Nalin had painstakingly added delicate, intricate beadwork to the carved wood, patterns of morning stars and eagles, symbols of her own heritage woven into his. Her breath caught in her throat. "You kept them," she whispered, recognizing the small beads she had been working on, what felt like a lifetime ago. "Everything," he said softly. Together they carried it into their new home. The hearth, built from stones gathered from the local creek, stood waiting. They hung the cradle board in the place of honor, right above the mantel, where the firelight would make the beads shimmer and dance. It was a promise, a prayer, a symbol of the family they were building. A family born not of blood, but of courage, respect, and a shared hope for the future. The first breezes of a real spring finally arrived, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and turning the frozen ground soft and dark and full of promise. On the porch of their new home, Nalin sat in a rocking chair Gideon had made, a gentle rhythmic creak accompanying the song of the meadowlarks. In the cradle board, nestled in her arms, slept a 3-month-old infant named Emma Thompson. Her parents, new settlers, had been taken by the winter fever, leaving the tiny baby orphaned. The town had looked to Nalin and Gideon, and they, without a moment's hesitation, had opened their home and their hearts. The baby's peaceful breathing was a soft counterpoint to the sounds of the world waking up around them. In the newly tilled garden beside the house, Gideon worked the rich, dark soil, preparing the neat rows for the seeds they had saved. Every few minutes he would stop, lean on his shovel, and look up at the porch. At his wife, at the child. A slow, quiet smile would spread across his face. People from town would walk by on the road, no longer averting their eyes but calling out warm greetings. Mrs. Wheeler left a basket of fresh eggs on the porch rail. Sheriff Tomlin tipped his hat as he made his morning rounds. The pastor's wife stopped to coo over the sleeping baby, remarking how natural she looked in Nolan's arms. Gideon finally set his shovel aside and walked to the porch, his boots leaving dark prints in the damp earth. He stood beside Nolan's chair, and she reached up, taking his hand, their fingers intertwined with the comfortable ease of long practice. Together they watched the children playing in the street, their laughter echoing in the warm spring air. "We will have a home full of sons and daughters," Nayland said softly, her voice full of a peaceful certainty. "Some by birth, perhaps, but many by heart." Gideon squeezed her hand, his eyes on the beautiful sleeping child in the cradleboard his hands had carved, the cradleboard her hands had adorned. He listened to the sounds of their town, of their home, of the family they had built from the ashes of sorrow and loss, and he was content. The cradleboard swayed gently in the afternoon sun, its beadwork catching the light like captured stars. If this story reminded you that family is something you build, not just something you're born into, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I share stories like this all the time, and I'd love for you to be here for the next one. Thanks for listening.